Hello and welcome back to the programme. This is the New Culture Forum show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever now, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Simon Evans, a stand-up comedian and one of the presenters on GB News' Headliners. Now, Simon, thank you very much for coming in today. Despite your profession as a comedian, I must say that I find very little to laugh about in modern Britain. Not even 6 months into this Labour government, we've seen continuing high levels of immigration, both legal and illegal, an intensifying war on the English countryside by urban elites, and even recently, a Labour MP by the name of Tahir Ali pushing pretty brazenly for the adoption of de jure blasphemy laws in Britain. Are there reasons to be cheerful about the apparent decline through which we're living? And are you hopeful that a restoration of sorts can turn things around?
Well, I suppose the first category error you've made there is to think that a comedian has to seek for cheerful news in order to function, whereas in fact, in reality, of course, anyone on the satirical end of the spectrum is hoping that, our decline will accelerate and become that much more dramatic and entertaining. No, I don't see very much cause for cheerfulness under Starmer, and I feel particularly embittered that just at the moment which America have elected a new regime who hope to overturn the disastrous slide into insanity that we've seen there for the last few years. We've committed ourselves to 5 years of intensification, which is an absolute travesty. I mean, I had some sympathy with people who wanted 0 seats for the Tories because they've been such an absolute failure. I have some sympathy with people who voted Reform in order to confront the Tories with their failure on certain key, conservative and traditions, such as protecting the borders. And I also had some sympathy with Peter Hitchens' view that, you keep tight hold of nurse for fear of something worse. And indeed, we have already found it. But anyone who thought that Labour were going to come in and the grown-ups were going to be back in the room, this kind of absurd notion that the Tories had been gradually deteriorating into a tiresome rabble of infighting, and that this would end, and that the Labour would come in and it would all get sorted out. And more seriousness, it's been. I think they must surely have been disabused of that fantasy by now.
Do you not think that some people do, some people don't? I wax and wane on this point, but that Reform, if it scales up its efforts, can achieve something similar to what Trump has recently achieved in 2029?
Well, there are a number of reasons why they might be able to, and a number of reasons why they might not. I do think our problems are quite different from America's in a way. Obviously, the woke thing is a similar problem. Immigration is quite different in many ways. For instance, in America, I think it has always had a vaguely porous southern border and is a question of degree rather than quality, which is changing their demographics there. And as they've discovered, of course, it's quite interesting that a lot of the people who have come across that border in the last 10 or 15 years have turned out to be considerably more socially conservative than the Democrats might have hoped, and might have been a significant part of Trump's victory. Our immigration is nothing like as easily assimilated and integrated into traditional British values, and it contains considerably more dangerous elements.
Before I bring in Connor, I want to push back on that a little bit. I would say that America's system of immigration has been selecting against quality and against cultural proximity since the 1965 Immigration Act. It's one of the more acceptable ways of opposing immigration restrictionists have found is by focusing on the illegality of it.
Yeah.
Because it's all of a sudden you can couch your concerns purely in terms of process rather than in terms of the results that follow from whether that process is followed or whether that process is not followed. I think that America has been radically demographically transformed since 1965 in ways that the architects of that bill promised would not happen.
Promised, but probably knew they were lying.
Likely knew that they were lying. And I don't think that, I agree with you that they are much more socially conservative. So if we think of conservatism as a kind of abstract textbook philosophy with bullet points on it, you can ask questions like, do you agree with gay marriage? Do you agree with abortion? Do you think that worshipping a god is an important focal point in society? If you ask immigrants those sorts of abstract questions, then you will get socially conservative answers. That's true. But so much of conservatism, one of the things that distinguishes it from rival philosophies is that it's not just an abstract textbook style system of propositions. It's also a question of what are you conserving? And just because an immigrant feels terribly conservative about their own country or about their own culture, it doesn't necessarily mean that they adopt conservative attitudes towards their host. And I think we've encountered that. We encounter it here in Britain as well. You have Muslim constituencies which are very, very conservative on all the kind of social attitudes. So but vote Labour. And we've seen similar patterns. True, Trump's he's adopted some Hispanic support recently, and that shouldn't go neglected, but it cuts against the grain of what's been happening since 1965.
I agree with that. Of course, I've only grown up, and you even more so, post-90s. Well, I was literally probably born, I was like Midnight's Children with the Immigration Act, born in May 65. I don't suppose that's that day. But no, you're absolutely right, and that did change the map. And it was a sort of de facto Northern European immigration until then, and it has made America much more of a rainbow nation than it used to be. But I do think that it is legitimate to some extent to say that America really has been, if not a nation of immigrants, certainly a nation of settlers, which has had, settlers then as if it was Andrew Tate, settlers, but a nation in which successive waves have layered like strata, and you can look at some of them afterwards and go, there was this mass extinction at this point, and this is what we can pin it on. But they have adapted to it. They have an extraordinarily resilient economy. They have a huge amount of natural resources they're still able to draw on in order to achieve some degree of economic resilience. They are, of course, far more skeptical about net zero, to say the very least. And they have the petrodollar still, although however long that will last, I don't know. But with 30-something trillion in debt now, they still seem to have a fairly robust currency. So, there are a lot of very significant differences there. Whereas this country, honestly, I think if we had a thriving economy right now, a lot of people would become vastly more relaxed about the cultural changes that are occurring and visible on the high street and so on. But sadly, we don't have this, but on the other hand, that,
Connor wants to jump in.
I don't think at all they would be vastly more relaxed, particularly among the generations, because if you see the polling among young Muslims in the UK, it's not just the Henry Jackson stuff that came out recently that said 3/4 of them didn't think that Hamas did anything wrong on October the 7th. It's other polling, I think it was Policy Exchange, that says the younger ones are far more radical, and that's second and third generation. And not to invoke sort of a young man's privilege here, Harrison and I went to school in these sort of mixed demographic and cultural environments, and from an early age, the divides among culture and ethnicity were very stark. You had the Nigerian kids arguing the Ghanaian kids, and then arguing the Caribbean kids, and then all the black kids would consolidate and have some sort of animus occasionally against the white kids, even if one-on-one, they were a lot more hospitable. And so I think, and this is the same sort of thing that people growing up in Luton, you invoked Andrew Tate, would say about Pakistani kids in their school versus the white English kids. Even if they know them interpersonally one-on-one, when you consolidate them as an ethnic and religious bloc, they become a lot more hostile. So even if people were a lot more prosperous, prosperity is only really something that you can negotiate, or you can have conversations about marginal tax cuts or business rates among a homogenous population like you did in the 70s and 80s with Thatcher. But two, even if they were more economically prosperous, it would not overcome these cultural antagonisms. And I think you're seeing that in America now, after 1965, with the legal admission of the Somali community in Minnesota, which Ilhan Omar is representing, and she is openly sectarian. She is saying that I want to represent Somali interests in Congress. They've changed the state flag to look more like the Somali flag, suspiciously.
Yes.
And that's not just a result of...
Wow, I didn't know that. That's extraordinary.
It's not just a result of people pouring across the southern border and looking for handouts and looking for amnesty. It's a result of people who are very self-conscious about their imperialistic religious beliefs. They're not committed to abstract family values, like I think Reform seems to think these days. They're committed to dawah, the ideological advancement of the aims of Islam, and so they will use your tradition like a skin suit in order to advance their tradition. So I think even if you improve the economy, we'd still have these insurmountable issues.
Well, I tend to agree with you, and I'm certainly not saying, look, listen, we only just need to sort out the economy and everything will flow. I'm just saying I think the degree to which people feel economic pain at the moment, and Starmer and Reeves have obviously ramped that up, is going to make the natural. It's like when the water goes out, you can see who's swimming naked. That sense, but you can also see what flags are being flown. On the shores.
So it intensifies pre-existing grievances rather than creating them.
Absolutely, you become far more partisan. But I think it's interesting. I mean, virtually the first thing you mentioned there was the support for Hamas, the support for Gaza, which obviously reared its head as sectarian voting blocs emerged in the last general election, and the Green Party made a surprising number of Allahu Akbar, proclamations upon winning seats.
It means recycle in Arabic.
That I find that, yes, exactly, yes. I mean, to a degree, they have recycled the Green Party and put it to a fresh. They've recycled, reused, but that I find, intensely annoying. I'm half Jewish, and my sympathies are with Israel, but more to the point, I don't want to import anybody else's views. I don't want to have to take significant sides on this. We're not really significantly funding either side. It's not as if if you're in America, you can see why they make some. Because that is essentially, historically, even the British Foreign Office have regarded Israel as an American gunship in the midst of the desert.
Yes.
But
this is true.
It's just infuriating, and this is it. It's the importation of overseas feuds in which you feel you have to educate yourself in order to have an opinion.
Well, we are significantly funding the Gazans actually under Lord Cameron, because he decided at the exact same time that the Tories were going to have a now scrapped abortion-free vote on completely decriminalising abortion at all stages, he was going to dedicate millions in foreign aid to maternity supplies for children in the Gaza Strip. So they have absolute apathy to children unborn and born in this country, but we have to fork over millions for people in Gaza.
Yeah.
And so I personally am very apathetic on the Israel-Gaza conflict. I understand why the Israelis want to defend their national sovereignty. I would simply expect that we would do the same were we to be attacked in the same way. And the fact that the likes of the Labour government and the previous Conservative governments did not respond with similar anger to the thousands of girls attacked during the grooming gangs, as Israel did to the men, women and children raped and murdered and abducted during October the 7th, shows that our elite class is apathetic to our suffering, unlike that in Israel. I just want similar levels of loyalty from my politicians.
Agreed. Don't look back in anger. That's our attitude, isn't it?
The Home Office.
Absolutely unbelievable. And it does annoy me, and it annoys me when a lot of people who are theoretically detached and disinterested with regard to Israel-Gaza speak very hotly about the degree to which Jews don't feel safe on the streets of London during the Saturday protests and so on, but seem disinclined to speak up for Britain generally, from the same obviously malevolent force.
Yes, it's almost, it constitutes a radical victory for minoritarianism in a way, that in order to the implicit bargain that many people on the right make who want to object to mass replacement migration and its effects in Britain, it's disruptive and very deleterious. Socialist, gone. Can
I ask you a question, though, both of you then? So we've sort of agreed that the economic decline of Britain at the moment, or the pain we're all feeling, is not a question of solve that and you've solved everything. Is it an opportunity? Can you take it as an opportunity to harness the currently emerging and visible and strafing grievance felt across a wider demographic than might otherwise do so and make them wake up?
I definitely think so. And this is the point that I've made before. The really important thing in politics that politicians need to understand isn't when people are asked a given question, how do they fall in terms of their opinion? That does matter a bit. But what matters far more than that is the salience of the question in the public mind.
Yeah.
So if you ask people questions about net zero, at the moment, you probably will get most people in Britain saying that they're quite skeptical of it. Maybe, I don't know what the exact rates are, but let's say it's 52-48. People being skeptical of net zero. That's different from saying that you're going to be able to win an election platform on anti-net zero because it might rank 9th on their list of interests.
Yeah.
The economy and sort of fiscal concerns, day-to-day spending, the quality of public services, these tend to rank incredibly high on people's interests. And to be fair, increasingly so does immigration. I think is second in and around NHS and economy, public services generally, all that sort of thing. What Nigel Farage's genius in campaigning for Brexit was to get very arcane constitutional issues to suddenly become of immense importance to people. Like no one, if you listen to and read the books of the more kind of rarefied Brexiteers, if you read like Daniel Hannan's book, or if you read one of Jacob Rees-Mogg's speeches to Policy Exchange, that's why Brexit is a good idea, they talk about restoring Dicey's 19th century constitution. They talk about the arcana of the 1972 European Communities Act. This sort of stuff is not a vote winner in and of itself, even though if asked about it, will generally say that they are in favour of restoring sovereignty. The same with Starkey, it must be said, and Starkey's a friend of the show. But nevertheless, what you can do, if you can tie these issues to things that people really, really do care about, like immigration, which is what Farage did with Brexit. He made it about immigration. Likewise, I think you can do the same thing here. Like when people are feeling an economic pinch, more than an economic pinch, a serious economic squeeze, deleterious living standards, you point to how immigration is putting pressure on public housing, point to how it's putting pressure on the NHS, point to the tremendous welfare bill that's being spent, point to the crime, point to the $3 billion we spend a year on housing illegal immigrants in hotels. If you kind of
5.3 now.
5.3 now, it has recently revised upwards as of last week. If you cluster all these together, then that can become an incredibly formidable electoral proposition to people. And so, yeah, I do agree that you can, not in cynical Machiavellian ways, but for the good of the nation, harness this discourse.
Well, it's why their heads are above water and they can see it clearly.
Yes,
It's not cynical to, point certain things out that appeared on the horizon when the middle is.
You're just fear-mongering. Well, what if the fears are well-founded?
And I do think there is that interest, there's a lot of disingenuous bantering back and forth of statistics whereby it's presented that the NHS would collapse if it weren't for immigration, and Sam Ashworth-Hayes has done some excellent work on this. I'm sure you know his stuff.
Yeah. Connor's done some good work on that as well, about care visas in particular, haven't you?
Yes, so in 2022 to 2023, Miriam Cates, MP, put together a study of 70,000 health and social care visas that were handed out during a given period. She found that they only filled 11,000 vacancies. So all of these low-wage, paid by the taxpayer workers who are bringing over an equivalent or not more number of dependents are coming over on health and social care visas and then disappearing out of the system into low-wage work. And even the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, the disreputable crooks that they are, came out with a report earlier this year that did very well on this channel in a clip that people I'm sure have watched, where they said for every £1 that is put in by a small sliver of tax-contributing high-skilled immigrants, low-wage immigrants that are on skilled worker visas are taking out £1.60 by the time they get to the average age of life expectancy. So we're going to get to about 350% debt to GDP by 2074. And that's just at current levels. But as we know, those current levels are wrong because the recent revision of the ONS net migration statistics have gone up by about 150,000 people they just forgot to count in 2022 to 2023 to a record over 900,000 net. So we're getting record numbers of foreign dependents who are committing more and more crimes, being put up at the taxpayer's expense, and nobody wants to change this. And if you link the two in the minds of the voter, your energy bills are going up, your taxes are going up.
Yes.
We are funding the housing for increasing numbers of foreign criminals who do not need to be here. And our foreign aid budget is increasing from 14 billion a year to 32 billion a year being spent on these foreign criminals, while pensioners are having their winter fuel allowance taken away.
Farmers being fleeced.
You will win votes.
There's the extraordinary statistic you must have seen with the revenue they hope to gain from the inheritance tax
By the end of the decade.
mapping almost perfectly onto the amount of money leaving the country to in foreign aid specifically to farmers.
It's extraordinary. I think 500. In Rwanda, something like 520 million is spent
That's exactly right.
subsidizing foreign farmers, and they expect. Bear in mind, this is just an expectation. The OBR expects, or might be the Treasury rather than the OBR, but in any case, some government, Kwango, expects that 500 million will be raised by the end of the decade.
I would imagine. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I don't know whether the Farmers Union have come in on this or whether people like Clarkson and so on are able to do what, Toby Young did with the Free Speech Union, create some sort of, the panel that can advise and so on. There will be legal workarounds, I suspect. And I suspect, actually, Rees will not get anything like the money she hopes to anyway out of them. I really hope so,
Well, they haven't probably cost it. They've said they're not going to publish the full figures until 6 months out before the policy is implemented. Right. And then the Labour activist who BBC Verify used to fact-check the claim that 70,000 farms are going to be affected, and he then said only 500 farms will be affected. After he was caught out by the Telegraph, he then went and did his own fairly costly assessment, and he said, their numbers are wrong. And so what we should do instead is we should raise the threshold so that only the wealthiest of farmers have their land confiscated from them so it can be sold off to BlackRock. And it's like, okay, the purpose of the system is what it does. They're not trying to raise funds for the NHS because we only fund the NHS for one day, and they're giving away that money to foreign farmers anyway.
They're trying to reshape the countryside, and they made it quite clear. A couple of people have said the quiet part out loud, on this front. I'm trying to remember who the one was. I mean, I think it's, certain sort of ridiculous commentators like Terry Christian and so on have said so, but there was
one on The Guardian as well.
Yeah. Can't remember who it was now, but it was, it will bring new blood into the countryside. Well, how will it do that exactly? If you're not saying that the family-run farms will have to be sold off, how will it bring new blood in? Now, the only way it will do that is by hacking the head off an existing traditional family business. It is so driven by spite, meanness, envy, that the lowest human emotions are directed towards farmers, and quite openly. It is, I'm sure you've covered this on numerous occasions, but it is incidentally a very, very obvious example of the projection with the left endlessly tell us that the right is hate-fueled and divisive. In fact, they are the party of hate.
Absolutely, and it's also like a very kind of brazen escalation of client politics in this country as well, because they know that farmers are instinctive, natural, conservative-minded people with a small c, so they're certainly not going to be voting Labour in any hurry, and they also want to feather the nest of all of the kind of bureaucrats who work in the public sector, who many of whom are not doing sort of estimable work at all. But I mean, there was a recent Conservative Way Forward report which estimated that £8 billion of savings could be made each year if we were to defund the state-funded, taxpayer-funded, effective woke patronage system that feathers the nest of DEI consultants and all the hope not hate, all of the Unida Millet.
As much as Trump and Unida Millet, probably more so immediately, that is Argentina's problems probably map more closely onto ours at the moment.
But this goes to the point as well, Simon, that like libertarianism is actually not that much of a vote winner in itself, but when you again tie it to these very sort of volatile concerns that people do have, it can be considerably more successful. Another, in my view, very in many ways counterintuitive downside of mass immigration is that it makes free speech have less purchase in a society. And this, on the surface, you might not expect this to be the case. You might expect, well, gosh, the more cultures there are brimming together, the more jazzy things are going to be.
You don't have to guess. I mean, Singapore was, of course, one of the great success stories of the century because Lee Kuan Yew immediately identified that as a problem. And it was not a great success story from a free speech point of view. He had extraordinarily authoritarian policies in order to elevate it politically and economically.
But there is this kind of intuitive, and like Eric Kaufman would call it, kind of left modernist idea. That the more cultures you have, the more spicy things are, the more jazzy things are. Everything's like Camden Town, and everyone's sort of getting along while different. I know.
Can't be done. And there are a number of great writers who've explored this, with great articulation years ago. Theodore Dalrymple's very good on this sort of matchup. But he is. The problem is that a lot of intellectuals who write columns. And this has been Paul Johnson's book on intellectuals, going back to Rousseau, if not before. A lot of the problem is that intellectuals who write columns on the left and the right, but particularly on the left, massively overestimate the extent to which everyone is like them.
Yes.
They love it. They love going into a salon, full of aliens, like the reprobates that Alec Guinness warns about in Star Wars, and the cantina. They love going into places like that and arguing furiously about the destiny of Chile or Uganda or just talk about football or something. They because they live in the mind and with that, but millions and millions of people are not comfortable with that, and they react to dispute, debate, controversy by beheading teachers. Not by kind of engaging in the argument and shaking hands afterwards and going home going, well, that was an interesting and entertaining way to spend the evening. But it's they red lines have been crossed immediately and they won't have it.
Yes, yeah. And as a comedian, presumably you've noticed this quite a bit. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, I'll start with a more nuts and bolts type question. Do you feel personally implicated in and concerned by, I forget politically, which obviously you do and we all do, but as a comedian, it's a very kind of envelope pushing profession, and quite right too. Do you feel personally implicated in and concerned by the very low water in which free speech finds itself in Britain today?
Yes, I do, absolutely. I think it was like at least 10 years ago, I had a line which I only share with other comedians, never did it on stage, but it would be almost like if you were to do a podcast interview with other comedians, would say, if there were three things you wouldn't joke about on stage because you feared for your life, what would the other two be? And I would still say that, and I think it's still opposite. But I wouldn't want to say I don't particularly want to do material about Islam, but it is absolutely the case that I would be physically afraid of doing so if I went in hard. So that's not good. But
presumably you're terrified of the Mormons as well, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Hugh Grant taking on the Mormons in Heretic. Yeah, it is like I'm losing over the Heretic too. I think the problem in the comedy clubs at the moment is, I always said, a lot of cab drivers used to say to me, they pick you up outside a gig and they say, oh, comedian, I expect you find it very difficult nowadays because, people are walking on eggshells. And I said, well, there is always an edge. There is always an edge in comedy and you work on the edge, So 20, 30 years ago, the edge might have been, what could you say about gay liberation or gay marriage? Well, now gay marriage is settled pretty much, and not many comedians would try and explore whether or not gay marriage was working because it just doesn't feel like an edge anymore. It's so settled in people's minds. Then there are other things that are too edgy, and one of those certainly would be, whether or not Islam, can it coexist peacefully with the West? People are too terrified of addressing that. But there's always something somewhere where you can work the edge, and people go, this is a little bit, I feel a little bit threatened, but I feel excited by it rather than terrified, What is happening now, which is more dangerous and more suffocating and more likely to lead to the death of comedy, is that people take offence on behalf of other people. So you can look at a room, an audience. You might only be able to see the first couple of rows, but you can get a sense of who's in here tonight. How's this going to go if I do jokes at, I don't know, the expense of racist uncle kind of scenarios or whatever? Play with that idea. I am the racist uncle, And you think, well, they might find that funny. But if they start thinking, I find that funny, but I'm concerned that there may be, somebody in the room for whom that issue is, and when I don't know if you saw recently, for instance, the pressers, as they call them, for Wicked, Ariana Grande and the two witches, that level of mental illness, in like Class A, whatever the term is, grade A actresses, the top tier of Hollywood royalty or singers in musicals. If you see that in the room and people start thinking, oh my God, if I better not make a joke about being green, in front of people.
Tough crowd.
Yeah, then everyone is checking themselves. I mean, a very obvious test of this is the degree to which the darkness in an auditorium guarantees
induces a sense of courage in the comedian.
Safeness, yeah. So you want the audience to be in complete darkness because they will then know that they can laugh and not be identified by anyone more than, a couple of seats away. And corporates are particularly important for this because in corporates, what we call corporates, as in you're entertaining a large company or an award ceremony or something, people there are in a work setting and they're particularly concerned they'll get reported to HR if they're seen laughing at the wrong joke. But if you can bring the lighting down in the room so that people feel a little bit safer, laughter in the dark it means that really, that you can laugh with impunity. There's a general opinion going around in comedy. I think I said it before I saw it written anywhere else, but every time I've said it to anyone, everyone else has agreed in a way that I think they've all been thinking it. Which is that until quite recently, if you went to a comedy club, there was like a social contract that had been, you granted license to the comedian to say the unsayable, to say out loud things you'd only been thinking before, and you might laugh at them, but you still probably wouldn't say them in company, certainly not at a dinner party if there were a couple of people you didn't know. And there's been a change recently. And now, if you go to a comedy club, you are more likely to see comedians policing the sort of things you actually think, and like almost like laughing at the incorrect, not laughing going, I know we aren't supposed to say this, but this is what we all think. And instead, people find their WhatsApp chats, for instance. I don't think there's many people now who aren't involved in a couple of WhatsApp chats with some good friends where they share jokes that, the kind of gallows humour. And of course, various officers of the Metropolitan Police have been disciplined and these things come out. But there are a number of people. You have a few friends and you start sharing sick jokes, dark jokes. I don't think many people consider that they have revealed a darkness in the souls of their friends they didn't suspect was there before. Instead, it's just a place where you can let off steam. And then by comparison, comedy clubs feel distinctly unlicensed. They feel more like safe spaces in the university sense.
Yes. I suppose another aspect of that is that even if you were to darken the room a little and the audience were to feel more confidence, and consequently the comedian is also likely to feel more confidence. There's also the problem which I've noticed, maybe I'm wrong about that, so maybe I'm being unfair, you've got your finger on the pulse of British comedy much better than I do, but is it not also the case that the race-based and gender-based criteria that define the woke war on merit in particular, so forget just the cultural sensitivities aspect of it, but just the meritorious comedians as opposed to bad comedians, has that led to a decline in the quality of comedian that we've seen coming through the ranks in Britain? Because weirdly in America, it doesn't seem to be the case. There are some very well-known, talented young comics, and there might be all sorts of reasons why America is different from Britain, but you don't really see that coming through.
I mean, I suppose I will say two things. Firstly, I'm not sure I have got my finger on the pulse of that kind of level, that tier of comedy, because I've been a touring comedian for about 10 years now. So I do go to the Edinburgh Fringe every August. But apart from that, I don't really work the circuit very often.
All right.
I don't know who's coming through. It does seem to me that when I tune into Live at the Apollo now, it's not the quality. You don't see the people, and you do wonder whether there is a bit of DEI thinking going on there. But I do, if I'm really honest, I do also suspect that comedy is going through possibly a period, a sort of fallow period, just simply because it's slightly exhausted. It's been going on for about 45 years now, the current wave of comedy. It started in the early 80s with Alexis Sale and Rick Mayall and so on. And it had a big second wave. I think of them as the early rock and rollers. I think of the mid-90s as being like the Beatles and the Stones and the Eddie Izzards, the Harry Hills, Bill Bailey and Dylan Morans. Fantastically evolved, sophisticated, articulate, clever, thought-provoking, and yet inclusive comedy without trying too hard, and nobody was going, well, Bill Bailey's all very well, but I can't help noticing he's still a straight white male. Yes. It just didn't occur to people. And yes, there has been a kind of clamoring and everything is slightly, destroyed by that mindset. But equally, I think it might be the fact that comedy is moving on a little bit. Like, for instance, most comedians now, if they want to get started, will know quite quickly that it's no longer a question of pleasing the gatekeepers at the BBC and trying to get onto the panel games. TikTok. You've got to create your own online presence, and quite a few of those are actually quite based, as you might say. There's a guy called Ryan Long who produces fantastic videos in America again, or Canada possibly, I'm not sure, but really funny about the hypocrisy and incoherence of racism, anti-racism and what have you. But it doesn't come across as remotely hateful, just funny. Well, it has the same kind of tone, I guess, as a Joe Rogan podcast or whatever. It's just relaxed and very, very funny. And that's where you see a lot of more creativity now. And actually, even the Edinburgh Fringe, a lot of the shows that sell best are by people who've maintained their profile throughout the year online rather than playing the comedy clubs. So I wonder if actually there's a bit of a sense in which it's just becoming a slightly tired format. I mean, if this happens, my son, 17 years of age, desperately wants to be a rock star. He plays guitar and he plays it well and he's got a band at school. But even he knows that all his favourite bands are 30 years ago.
Yes.
It just isn't really happening now because there is an excitement the first time that happens. There was an excitement the first time John McLaughlin, introduced rock chops to jazz in the mid 70s. It's hard to sustain that 40 years later.
But the burgeoning success of meme culture, of which I fancy myself something of a connoisseur. Like I do like the kind of online right-wing memosphere that's great, which is very creative and which doesn't seem tired at all. It's very fresh. There's also a sense in which a lot of it has had to go underground in that way and has had to become anonymous. I mean, another thing I would have wanted to point out as well, I can't quite understand why there does seem to have been this period in the 90s and the early 2000s where comedy was still very, very irreverent, including towards what Eric Kaufman would call sort of accredited, sacralized minority victim groups. I mean, if you look at some of Jim Jeffries' old jokes, the Australian comedian, if you look at some of Frankie Boyle's old jokes, the Scottish comedian in the 90s and 2000s, extremely, extremely irreverent. Shows like Mock the Week, shows like Would I Lie to You? It seems so. But these people now, when you encounter them, they're usually lecturing and hectoring and pointing out all the manifold ways in which we're bad. Like I saw Stephen Fry being interviewed about the Trump election, and he just seemed like a pompous old bore, and like none of the freshness that you see in things like Blackadder. What is it that turned comedy from thinking of irreverence as a virtue of sorts to in the early 2010s and obviously now thinking that it is a kind of investor advice?
Well, there'd be a number of issues, and some would be specifically addressed to individuals and other be more general ways. I mean, we all know, the Great Awakening comes in 2012. It comes with extraordinary force and, all the search terms that demonstrate the sudden use of words like, transphobia or whatever suddenly start appearing in the New York Times. Comedians are, artifacts. We are voyagers on the same sea. We ride the same currents. So there's always going to be a degree to which a comedian, if he wants to keep his career, has to recognize and work with that to some extent, and people just became rather humorless and straight-faced about all those things and started to be concerned about punching down. Frankie Boyle's an interesting case, for instance, because I think, even I found some of the targets of his jokes to be unacceptable. I think Rebecca Adlington, was it the swimmer? He was really brutal. Ugly. It was just really unpleasant.
It was sometimes quite tasteless.
I think somebody took him aside, or possibly he took himself aside, paused, reflected, took a breath, and thought, actually, I'm a great joke writer, and have a couple of people who work with him as well that I know, which is no criticism. He is an extremely effective comedian working on the dark and actually rather poetic end of this. He's almost like a kind of, Les Dawson had a certain poetry with him when he was referring to his mother-in-law, but very creatively, and Frankie has that. And he just thought, actually, I would rather use my skills to address Theresa May and Rupert Murdoch. And to some extent, it is disappointing, but I don't blame him for that, in fact, because really what I just enjoy is the wordcraft that is used, The shame is that other people haven't come in and carried on, addressing, being playful, as you say. Louis C.K., who was a fantastic comedian, probably still is, got caught up with, I think to some extent, the shallow end of Me Too. Some people found, I don't know if you remember what he was.
Hard to forget it once you're told.
Yeah. It was certainly unpleasant, and he was right to apologise and again to sort of step back. But there were plenty of other comedians, colleagues of his, who said, it was more of a quirk than like abuse. I don't want to get entangled in that. The point is, he was fantastic at doing that kind of stuff. He could talk about white guys using the N-word. He could talk about. He had a whole opening thing where he was talking about how he used, the most famous anti-gay slur in his slang. I don't know what your rules are on the podcast, so I'll try and work around it. But, he did that in an episode of a podcast. It was fantastic. And there was a kind of learning, but there was also exploration. You got to laugh, and then you also got to reconsider it. It was an holistic attempt to, expose and discuss inconsistencies or, casual indifference to other people's feelings and so on, and yet still keep the laughs in, and it is really hard to do that. It's getting harder and harder to do that, and it is a shame. Like all things, you hope the pendulum will swing, and some people have said, I've heard more than one person say, woke is in the rearview mirror now. Well, we'll see. I'm not sure. Not sure in this country.
Do you think it is, Connor? Well, certainly not in this country. It's better with Harrington, obviously, a couple of weeks ago. But
yeah, not remotely. We were going to become a woke North Korea, even if Europe and the US were on screaming from it. I actually think on the topic of why comedy got co-opted, I think they were trying to, over time, work out their place in what Adam Bolton once called the delicate broadcast ecology. Because if you think of the mid-2000s, you think Sirius XM, you think Howard Stern, and who has since gravitated over towards the Uniparty, particularly being driven deranged by being a shut-in during COVID. But Opie and Anthony Show, Patrice O'Neill, Nick Apollo, Tough Crowd, like that was cutting edge comedy. You could negotiate differences, you could be very provocative, but then what ended up happening was the more provocative they got, the more penalized they got by the FCC. Over here, you had Ofcom being introduced by Tony Blair and cracking down those sorts of shows. And I must disagree slightly with Frankie Boyle and Mock the Week, because I never think they were on the cutting edge. I think if you look at their targets, they were always trying to mock people who are either gauche, and they did have those, let's say, tasteless jokes about Harvey Price, for example.
Yeah.
But then they always said, the Foreign Office under the Tory government or under Tony Blair is the Department of N-word bombing. And it was always saying, it was always using plosive language, but to say you're insufficiently progressive. And it was always to relegate politics as this sort of sphere which had already been settled. And if you didn't think it was settled, you always got met with the sort of eyebrow raise and the sardonic smirk. Isn't it ridiculous? And that's why QI, Would I Lie to You, Mock the Week, Have I Got News for You, all take on this very bland, very above the fray, very Ed Davey Lib Dem election campaign, post-political idea. And it becomes ingratiated into, let's say, the entertainment industrial complex, where politics becomes indistinguishable from news, but both have very shallow content. This is why all the late night hosts have a revolving door of Nancy Pelosi or AOC or Kamala Harris on there to just act as propaganda mouthpieces on behalf of the regime. And they use comedy as a form of mockery, not of the differences so we can get over them, but to put up straw men of their political opponents and make it really unpopular and personally reputationally destructive in order to support candidates like Donald Trump. I think they're circumventing that by going on, like Ryan Long is on YouTube or TikTok, or like Matt Rife is on Instagram, where they tried to cancel him and he put up a link to his apology in his Instagram bio, and it was to buy helmets for the soft skull disabled, for example. Because if you're not contingent on the broadcast ecology to make your money, you don't have to play by their rules.
No, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And it is interesting, as you say, the kind of uniparty of comedy that control the panel games. I will say, I don't know if you want to say it's in their defense or whether it's just pragmatic, but the reality is if you try and put a whole range of views on panel games, all you get is discord and arguing and half the panelists looking disgruntled at the joke that's just got some laughs. What the BBC could have done, of course, is had a right of centre Mock the Week or at least something a little bit more reactionary, even in the old-fashioned sort of call my bluff sort of sense, just where the actual game, the medium is the message, where what you're playing with. Mock the Week, I think it was a good entertainment product. It got decent views. I did not really think of it as satire most of the time, or certainly it was just it's kind of student humor, playing with memes and tropes that students were comfortable with. And if they were confronted with something which didn't immediately harmonize with their baseline, suppositions, they would fall silent and frown. So you're on a hiding to nothing to try and stick in a right-wing comedian onto one of those panels, and that is, you're absolutely right. And of course, the other thing it does, it was interesting, wasn't it? Do you remember, was it Jimmy Kimmel had Trump on and ruffled his hair?
Yes.
And everyone on the left was furious about that because exactly, and they knew that's exactly what they'd been doing to the left all that time. Yes. They had realized, they understood that if you have Nancy Pelosi or whatever on one of those shows, you make it seem like that's the normal default setting for a human being, and then you can call J.D. Vance weird for his obsession with people's genitalia and who gets to go to which bathroom. And you're like, that's not the weird thing. The weird thing is demanding that men get to go into women's bathrooms, not being obsessed with that not happening.
Seems to stand to reason.
And they fell apart, but that has been a trick of the left for a very long time, humanizing what are actually arguable positions.
Well, listen, Simon, it's been great talking to you. We're going to do an extra members section now.
Okay, I will ramp it up a bit.
Where I'm going exclusive, more so, and in which I'm going to be asking a question in particular about whether. I know that you probably love Monty Python, you probably love Blackadder, you probably love all of that sort of classic British comedy, but I wonder whether those series have had a kind of deleterious effect on our national self-confidence, in spite of the fact that, of course, they were very, very funny. So we're going to talk a little bit about that now, whether there have been sort of second-order consequences of irreverent humour in the 70s and 80s. But listen, thank you so much for joining us for this segment of Deprogrammed. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello, if you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.